In the late 1990s, the technology industry did not slow down, it accelerated. Every few months, a new computer appeared. Every year, processors doubled in speed. Every advertisement promised the same future: faster, cheaper, more powerful. Progress was measured in numbers: megahertz, gigabytes, benchmarks. Speed wasn't just a feature, it became a belief. If you moved fast, you were relevant. If you slowed down, you were finished. In that world, stillness was dangerous, and silence was mistaken for weakness. This was the environment surrounding Apple in the mid to late 1990s. From the outside, Apple looked quiet, too quiet. Competitors were everywhere. PC manufacturers were flooding the market with options, dozens of machines, dozens of price points, dozens of promises. Walk into an electronics store at the time and you were overwhelmed immediately. Bright screens, crowded aisles, salespeople rushing from customer to customer. Everything screamed urgency. Everything demanded attention. And Apple seemed absent. Not invisible, just strangely restrained. That silence unsettled people, because in business, silence is often interpreted as fear, or worse, surrender. At that time, many believed Apple had already lost. The only question was how long it would take before the end became official. But to understand why Apple's silence mattered, you first have to understand how deeply the industry had come to fear slowing down. During the 1990s, technology companies were rewarded for movement, not necessarily for clarity, not even for quality, but for activity. New product announcements boosted stock prices. More features justified higher costs. Frequent updates signaled relevance. Doing more looked like progress, and doing less looked like failure. This belief shaped how companies behaved under pressure. When sales dipped, they didn't pause, they launched something new. When customers hesitated, they added features. When competitors surged, they copied. No one wanted to be the company that stopped moving, because stopping felt like admitting defeat. Inside this environment, panic often disguised itself as productivity. And nowhere was this more dangerous than inside a company already struggling to define itself. By 1997, Apple was not just losing money, it was losing coherence. The company that once represented creativity had become difficult to explain even to itself. Ask a customer what Apple stood for at the time, and you'd often get silence. Ask an employee, and you might get 3 different answers. Apple wasn't failing because it lacked talent or because it lacked ideas. It was failing because it had lost focus. Too many projects were running at once. Too many teams were pulling in different directions. Too many products existed without a clear reason to exist. And in a culture that worshipped speed, the obvious solution seemed simple: move faster, launch more, react harder. That's what investors expected. That's what analysts advised. That's what history suggested. Most companies in Apple's position followed that script. They fought noise with more noise. They answered confusion with complexity. They mistook motion for control. And in doing so, they exhausted themselves. But before Apple could choose a different path, it had to confront something more difficult than competition. It had to confront fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being left behind. Fear of silence. Because silence forces reflection, and reflection forces honesty. When everything is loud, you don't have to listen closely. But when things go quiet, every weakness becomes audible. By the mid-90s, Apple's weaknesses were loud to those inside the company. But outside, the world was too busy watching the race. Everyone wanted Apple to sprint. No one wanted it to stop and think. And yet thinking was exactly what the moment demanded. Stillness in that environment felt unnatural, almost irresponsible, because stillness meant not reacting, and not reacting meant resisting instinct. Human instinct tells us that when danger approaches, we should move, we should act, we should do something, anything, to feel in control. Businesses are not immune to that instinct. In fact, they often amplify it. The larger the organization, the louder the internal pressure to respond. Meetings multiply, strategies overlap, initiatives stack on top of one another. Movement becomes constant. But constant movement without direction creates a very specific kind of chaos. Not visible chaos, but internal chaos. By 1997, Apple was drowning in that kind of motion, and the world assumed the solution would be more of it. What no one expected was restraint. And in the next part of this story, we'll slow down even further. We'll look at Apple before the pause, before the decisions, before the mythology. Because before Apple found clarity, it had to sit with discomfort. And that discomfort is where this story truly begins.
When Steve Jobs returned to Apple, the story was already being written. The story people like to tell now is simple. The visionary returns. The genius takes control. The company is saved. But reality was quieter and far more uncomfortable. Jobs didn't walk into a company ready to be rescued. He walked into a company that barely recognized itself. Departments were disconnected. Projects overlapped without coordination. Teams competed internally for resources. There was talent everywhere, but no alignment. And alignment, not intelligence, was what Apple lacked most. The pressure on Jobs was immediate. Investors wanted reassurance. Employees wanted direction. The media wanted spectacle. Everyone expected action, announcements, strategies, a roadmap to survival. But clarity doesn't arrive on demand, and leadership at moments like this is less about answers and more about restraint. Jobs understood something instinctively. Before Apple could move forward, it had to stop pretending it knew where it was going. Most turnaround stories start with innovation, a new product, a bold invention, a technical breakthrough. That's what people expected from Jobs. But innovation without focus only multiplies confusion. At the time, Apple didn't need new ideas. It had too many already. What it lacked was the courage to remove them. Innovation adds, restraint subtracts. And subtraction is far harder, because every product represents effort. Every project represents belief. Every idea has a team behind it. Cutting is personal. One by one, projects were questioned, not for quality, not for potential, but for necessity. Why does this exist? Who is it for? What problem does it truly solve? If there was no clear answer, it didn't survive. This wasn't optimization, it was elimination. Entire product lines disappeared, not because they failed, but because they distracted. And distraction at Apple's scale was fatal. Saying no meant disappointing people. It meant undoing years of work. It meant choosing clarity over comfort. This is the part rarely discussed. Every cut carries weight. Behind every canceled product is a group of people who believed in it. Engineers, designers, managers. Restraint doesn't feel strategic when you're living inside it. It feels cruel. Jobs understood that, but he also understood something else. Keeping everything would be far crueler, because it would guarantee collapse. Sometimes leadership is not about saving ideas, it's about saving the company that might one day create better ones. Slowly, the noise began to fade. Meetings became shorter. Decisions became clearer. Teams understood what mattered. Apple reduced its entire focus to 4 products. No ambiguity, no overlap, no distractions. For the first time in years, the company could see itself again, not as a collection of experiments, but as a coherent whole. Structure returned, and with structure came calm. Here's what's easy to miss. After the cuts, Apple did not immediately surge forward. There was no rush to replace what was removed. They waited. They observed. They listened. Waiting in business is often framed as weakness, but in this moment, it was discipline. It allowed Apple to feel the absence of unnecessary work, and in that absence, something important emerged: clarity. With fewer distractions, the right questions finally surfaced. What should Apple make? Who should it serve? What does it stand for now? These questions could not be answered in noise. They required space. They required silence. And Apple finally had both. Part 2 of Apple's story is not about products. It's about subtraction, about restraint under pressure, about choosing discomfort over chaos. In the next part, we'll see what emerged from that silence, not immediately, but inevitably. Because once clarity exists, the right action reveals itself.
Silence does not produce ideas immediately. That is its most misunderstood quality. When noise disappears, there is often an uncomfortable gap, a pause where nothing seems to happen. For Apple, this pause was intentional. They did not rush to replace what had been removed. They did not announce a new vision prematurely. They allowed the absence to exist. And in that absence, something subtle began to take shape. Not a product, a philosophy, a way of deciding what mattered and what did not. This was not creativity exploding, it was clarity settling. When the iMac finally appeared, many saw it as the turning point, a bold design, a clear identity, a confident statement. But the iMac was not the cause of Apple's recovery, it was the result. By the time it was built, the most important decisions had already been made. What to ignore, what to refuse, what not to chase. The iMac did not emerge from urgency. It emerged from restraint, from months of knowing exactly what Apple was no longer trying to be. Once focus exists, it compounds quietly. Fewer products meant deeper attention. Fewer features meant better execution. Fewer decisions meant stronger conviction. Apple no longer spread itself thin. Energy moved in one direction. Design and engineering were no longer negotiating priorities. They were aligned. And alignment over time creates momentum without noise. This was not explosive growth. It was stable growth, the kind that lasts. Years later, the pattern repeated. Apple resisted releasing dozens of phones, resisted flooding the market with variations, resisted reacting to every competitor's move. Instead, it refined again and again. This wasn't coincidence, it was culture. Restraint had become instinct, not as a strategy, but as a habit. And habits shape outcomes far more reliably than ambition. Most companies don't fail because they lack ideas. They fail because they lack judgment. They say yes too often. They confuse opportunity with obligation. They mistake reaction for leadership. They move because movement feels safe. Stillness feels risky. But Apple's story reveals a different truth. Action taken too early is often worse than action taken late, because premature movement locks in confusion. Knowing when not to act is not passive, it is deliberate. It requires confidence without validation, patience without reassurance, leadership without applause. Stillness is not the absence of work, it is work without visibility. And that kind of work rarely looks impressive in the moment, but it changes everything over time. The lesson Apple offers is not about technology, it's about timing, about resisting the instinct to respond to everything, about understanding that clarity arrives only when noise is removed. This applies beyond companies, to teams, to creators, to individuals. Sometimes the most powerful decision is to wait. Apple did not survive because it moved faster. It survived because it stopped, because it chose silence when panic was louder, because it valued clarity over activity, and because it understood that not every moment demands action. Sometimes the smartest move is restraint, to pause, to reflect, to do nothing, until the right thing becomes obvious.